Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to EWC Insights Asia Pacific Transitions. Thank you for joining this event live, and thank you to those who are watching the recording. My name is Panwin Yoking. I am a fellow at the e-CNY Center, and it's an absolute pleasure for me to be here moderating today's session. For today's event, we have a presentation from Dr. Christopher McNally. Dr. McNally is a professor of political economy at Chaminade University. He is also an adjunct senior fellow at the e-CNY Center. His research focuses on comparative capitalism, especially the nature and logic of sino-capitalism. He is currently working on a research project that studies the implications of China's international re-emergence under global order. He has held fellowships conducting field work and research at the Asia Research Center in West Australia, and also Institute of Asia Pacific Studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, as well as at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. He has edited 4 volumes, including an examination of China's political economy entitled China's Emergent Political Economy, Capitalism in the Dragon Layers. He has authored numerous book chapters, policy analyses, editorials, and articles in journals such as Review of International Political Economy, Business and Politics, Communist and Post-Communist Studies, International Politics, and World Politics. And in this presentation, Dr. McNally will be discussing the Chinese digital currency and also the future of money. And in terms of logistics, his presentation will be roughly 40 minutes long, and then we will move on to a Q&A session. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to drop your question in the Q&A box, and we will try our best to get through as many questions as possible. And our next EWC Insight speaker will be Dr. Kim Fassler, and her talk will be on October 19th at 2 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. So without further ado, I will stop the introduction here, and over to you, Dr. McNally.
Thank you very much, Fanwin, for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be back at the East-West Center, even if virtually. I am sharing my screen now. I hope everybody can see it. So I'll have a small PowerPoint to accompany this presentation. Well, my purpose today is to basically, move this. Oh, here we go. Oh, is to explore a bit the future of money, in particular the international monetary system. But I'd like to kind of put forward a bit of a caveat that we are truly living in an age of uncertainty, as the centennial issue of Foreign Affairs just stated. We are witnessing changes, geopolitical, economic, technological, pandemic-wise, that we really haven't experienced at this degree and this intensity over the past several decades. And so a lot of the things that are going to be happening in the monetary realm will be influenced by these, and therefore it is really quite difficult to predict what the future of money actually will be. Now, I will begin with financial statecraft because a lot of things have been happening in that realm. I will quickly discuss China's position in the international monetary system. I'll look at US dollar hegemony and then move over to the digital yuan. Finally, I look a bit at the prospects for the internationalization of the Chinese currency and end with a few concluding remarks. Now, as many of you are aware, Western sanctions vis-a-vis Russia have been levied at an extent that is unprecedented in the post-World War II era. Their scope has really undergone massive expansion. Russian banks have been barred from SWIFT. There are various embargoes, obviously, on Russian oil, energy exports. But in terms of finance, Russia has truly been cut off from the Western financial system for most matters and purposes. And this Western or liberal international economic order, including the international monetary system, have often been seen as a public good, the infrastructures of which were basically important for the function of global finance and were open to all. This assumption has been basically diminished. By now, it's quite clear that this international financial system provides weapons, economic weapons, sanction weapons of unprecedented reach and effect. And therefore, we are really seeing within the global financial system somewhat of a watershed moment. Western sanctions on Russia have been very painful for the Russian economy, but they also have sent a public signal that the US and its allies are willing to weaponize the infrastructures of global financial system to their benefit. It is interesting to note in this respect that American officials, including from the Treasury, have come out and stated that this is a one-off issue or one-off level of sanctions and that this will not be repeated in the future. So they've tried to assure other actors in the international financial system that they will not be targeted to the same extent as the Russians. And indeed, at this point, there is no alternative to the American dollar. Indeed, looking at from where we stand right now, the dollar is more powerful and reigns more supreme than at any time in the past, probably 20, 25 years. But China, seeing what has happened to the Russian, basically fears a similar outcome. And this has been made quite clear by American officials that if China were to invade or even blockade or take more intense military actions vis-a-vis Taiwan, they would likely face a similar shutoff from the global financial system to what the Russians have. Now, the Chinese have to coexist with the neoliberal financial system as a subordinate member for the simple reason that all of their exports, most of their exports are denominated in US dollars, most Chinese savings are in US dollars, and their whole system basically remains based on the dollar. Indeed, for example, the amount of foreign currency that Chinese citizens can take out of the country is still established in US dollars, not in yuan. And as I mentioned, the Chinese fear the same outcome as to what happened to the Russians. So if we want to understand the Chinese attitude, the Chinese position vis-a-vis the global financial system, it is one that is mostly defensive. But within this defensive attitude, the Chinese are trying to carve out a new small ecosystem for their own currency that is ideally independent of the US dollar. And they're trying to do so without sacrificing state control. So they're trying to do two things: internationalize their currency, which generally involves liberalization, but at the same time retaining a great degree of state control. So the international monetary system and China's attitude towards it, basically Chinese efforts are focused on establishing technological, financial, and economic ecosystems that are independent of the US. So in many ways, what the Chinese financial statecraft has tried to reach is a sort of workaround solution, a situation where they remain within the liberal financial member as a very important member, but also carve out certain spheres of financial and monetary autonomy. Why are the Chinese doing this? Well, the simple reason is they don't have a choice. The US dollar remains dominant. Indeed, it's probably the area of global governance where American power remains most intact. Obviously, the United States is still very important technologically. We're seeing this with various sanctions levied against the Chinese in terms of high-tech exports and in the strategic military realm. But within the international monetary system, the US dollar continues to reign supreme. It accounts for roughly 60% of all global foreign exchange reserves. This is a number that has gradually come down from 70%. But even though reserves are held less in US dollars, the diversification away from the dollar has occurred mainly into currencies such as the Swedish krona or the South Korean won or the Australian dollar and Canadian dollar. So these are still Western currencies, allies of the United States, and therefore the Russians, faced with the sanctions that were levied in February, have very little opportunities to diversify into other currencies. One of the currencies they're doing this with is the yuan or Chinese renminbi. Now, ever since Nixon went off gold in 1971, arguments for the decline of the US dollar have been in vogue. At various points, such as in the 80s, and then again after the global financial crisis, and even right now, People have seen, analysts have seen that the great dominance of the US dollar would be difficult to sustain. Nonetheless, up until now, these prognoses have not come true. The main reason is that we have a reinforcing institutional system where everybody relies on the dollar, and that in turn reinforces the dollar's global monetary role, especially as a monetary anchor. And as I mentioned, at this point in September 2022, the US dollar continues to be in ascendance. Indeed, it is at one of the highest exchange rates in recent memory, vis-a-vis a long list of currencies. And at the same time, Chinese policies. It's not that the United States doesn't face economic problems. We're seeing the Federal Reserve just raise interest rates again by 75 basis points. And we can discuss these issues more in the Q&A. But the Chinese certainly are facing economic problems of their own. Zero COVID is basically decimating the Chinese economy. And clampdowns on tech enterprises and a continuing downturn in the real estate sector are not helping. All of this is undermining the attractiveness of the Chinese economy internationally, and therewith the attractiveness of the Chinese yuan. So as I mentioned at the outset of this seminar, we're really truly in an age of uncertainty, and it's extremely difficult to clearly foretell which currency or what will be dominant in 10 years. But as I mentioned as well, there is increasing unhappiness with the dominance of the US dollar, especially among developing economies. This includes the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but also countries such as Saudi Arabia and Turkey. They see this system as one that aids American power and can be weaponized by DC to basically kill an economy. Now, there are no signs so far of a clear diversification away from the US dollar, but one place to look for is Saudi Arabia's oil exports. Now, as I just mentioned, because of the sanctions on Russia, Russian-Chinese trade has very rapidly moved to the yuan, and the yuan has very rapidly ascended on the Moscow foreign exchange market to become by now the third, fourth most traded currency. Interestingly, again, the dollar and the euro are still ahead. But Saudi Arabia, I would argue, truly is the linchpin, or maybe the canary in the coal mine that will indicate a more lasting shift away from using the dollar by denominating Saudi Arabia's oil exports to China in yuan. And there's been reports that Beijing and Riyadh are talking about this, but so far nothing has been settled. Now, as mentioned, Chinese financial statecraft is deeply shaped by its subordinate position in the IMS. And China is highly dependent on the US dollar for its trade, investment, reserves, international asset allocations, basically everything. The Chinese have attempted to forge a number of workaround, hybrid institutional solutions to try to establish an ecosystem for the yuan or renminbi to become more important. And this inspiration, the approaches used, the policy tools that the Chinese have been developing, in many ways find inspiration from Chinese reform experiences on the domestic level, what I call the logic of Sinocapitalism. Recent efforts to pursue such workaround solutions really become clear in the case of launching what is likely to be the world's first major central bank digital currencies, CBDC. This currency was originally termed the DCEP, the digital currency electronic platform. Yes, quite a mouthful. Well, the Chinese have moved to just terming it the e-CNY, and CNY is the official currency symbol used for the Chinese yuan on the domestic market. So this is what is termed the digital yuan. Now, efforts have not been potentially attention-grabbing. Indeed, the Chinese have quite deliberately, it seems, toned down any news flow regarding launching the digital yuan. Reasons for this are probably that the Beijing Olympics should have served as the kind of big rollout, the big international launch. But noises, especially from the US Congress, were such that it seemed China might even be sanctioned. And indeed, American athletes were told not to touch the digital yuan due to privacy concerns. So since basically the Beijing Olympics in February 2022, for the last 6 months, there has been very little news. But the digital yuan, I think I've just got stuck. I hope you can, my picture has gotten stuck, but yeah, okay, I'm back again. But the digital yuan truly opens up a whole new dimension of monetary management and is, in my opinion, highly significant. Indeed, it will allow the Chinese government both to liberalize finance while keeping state control intact. So what is the e-CNY? Very briefly, I don't want to become too technical here, but it's basically a platform-based programmable digital token that will act like M0. This is central bank speak for cash in circulation. It cannot earn interest. It is like cash. To earn interest, it has to be deposited into a bank account. This will forestall disintermediation of the banking system and keep Chinese banks, as well as Alipay and WeChat Pay, Chinese internet platforms, payment platforms, in business. It is, though, different from a cryptocurrency. It is issued and supervised centrally by the People's Bank of China. So it does not have the decentralized, almost anarchical structure of Bitcoin or Ethereum. And as I just mentioned, it is platform-based. It's not based on distributed ledger technology, DLT, or what is more commonly referred to as blockchain technology. Blockchain technology is extremely energy intensive and requires a massive amount of computing power. It is not very scalable overall. Indeed, one of the problems that faces Bitcoin, and Ethereum has just addressed this issue, the energy use issue to some extent, but it's questionable whether their solution will actually really work as well. As I said, I don't want to go into the technicals here. No, the e-CNY works a lot more like WeChat Pay and Alipay. It's a platform-based electronic digital platform that basically moves money around and is under the People's Bank of China. Nonetheless, it is a digital token, so it does adopt various elements of cryptocurrencies, including trusted computing, various forms of encryption, and various platform integrations that make counterfeiting this digital token extremely difficult, if not impossible. Well, one should never say impossible with these things. I suspect someone is going to find a way around it. Counterfeiting is one of the oldest businesses of humanity. So, as I mentioned, its structure is quite similar to that of Alipay and WeChat Pay. e-CNY is now being tested in various Chinese cities, and just today we got news that it will be rolled out throughout the provinces of Guangdong, Jiangsu, and Sichuan in coming weeks and months. It wasn't very clear. As I said, the news flow has been really quite sparse. Authorities are using what I would term a cautious trial and error approach that aims to retain flexibility to adjust the e-CNY's operational model. But there has been one big development in 2022, and that's not the Beijing Olympics. Rather, it is that the e-CNY is now compatible with China's dominant payment apps, Alipay and WeChat Pay, which the People's Bank of China has made clear it complements. So there's been some analysis that the Chinese government is doing this to replace these dominant privately owned payment apps. And it seemed so up until about 1.5 years ago, when it became clear that no, they're not going to replace it, they're going to work with it. And users of Alipay and WeChat Pay right now actually can go into their app and they can touch a button that makes their payments into e-CNY if they're in designated trial cities and now provinces, and basically they switch over to digital tokens. And for the consumer, for the user, they really wouldn't notice much of a difference. There remain quite a few technical uncertainties. This is one of the reasons the Chinese are using a trial and error approach. There are privacy concerns that are quite considerable. The People's Bank of China has assured anonymity in transactions, so that transactions are anonymous up until only a certain amount. It's even not quite clear how much, probably 1,000 yuan, which is about $150. But those are the only amounts that will be fully anonymous. Theoretically, the People's Bank of China could even see these transactions, but it is unlikely to do so just because the amount of data and analysis involved. There are also a number of regulatory and legal issues, but the e-CNY has one massive advantage, and that's its digital traceability. In other words, this currency, if rolled out nationwide and used by the majority of consumers and investors and traders, will give the People's Bank of China unprecedented real-time insight into the creation, bookkeeping, and circulation of money. Stresses and risks to the financial system could be detected early on and addressed in a much more targeted manner than with now available tools. It could also aid in issues such as tax fraud, money laundering, other business practices that are illegal. And it could be extremely useful for banks to monitor their borrowers in real time, knowing how their businesses are doing. Now, one thing that is really unique about the e-CNY is that with its digital traceability, a whole new panoply of monetary tools could emerge. I will first mention one that is domestic. So we had the massive economic downturn triggered by the pandemic. And in the United States, as well as Europe and other countries, the federal government stepped in to distribute large amounts of money. Most of you are aware, those were PPP loans, as well as direct payments to citizens. This has created quite a lot of inflation because money was doled out irrespective, in many cases, of need or in just a sledgehammer approach. The Federal Reserve, via quantitative easing, flushed the financial system with money as well. That obviously aided the federal government's efforts, but the two of them actually worked very well together this time, compared to the global financial crisis in 2009 and 2010. And as a result, the economy recovered very rapidly, despite lockdowns and despite the fear of COVID. But as I mentioned, it created a lot of inflation. And that's what we're stuck now with. So quantitative easing and the tools that were employed in the West are sledgehammer approaches. With a digital currency, one could conceivably, if sufficient computing power and well-managed data systems and data analysis management tools are applied, directly see which businesses and which consumers are suffering and directly make them whole. This is truly a brave new world of money. For the Chinese, the e-CNY offers an additional opportunity. And that is that it could facilitate the establishment of a financial ecosystem for renminbi yuan trade internationally. And it could facilitate Chinese trade moving away from mainly being denominated in the dollar and the euro into mainly being denominated in the yuan. Indeed, a digital system for invoicing trade and for doing currency transactions could be much, much more cost-effective and less time-consuming. The Chinese have been experimenting already with existing initiatives. One is CIPS. This is the Chinese payment system that is linked to SWIFT, which is the big international Belgium-based financial transaction system. CIPS is a Chinese counterpart to it. The Chinese have never said that it should be different, that it should be rivaling SWIFT. Rather, the idea is just to have a separate yet interlinked autonomous system that allows more transactions with the yuan and also obviously less oversight and influence by the United States. So this project could be expanded. It has been expanding actually at quite a nice clip over the past 5 years, but with the digital yuan, it could really truly take off. It's still tiny compared to the amounts that are being transacted on SWIFT. And then there's a very interesting project going on that is called the mBridge project. And all of these are complementary to each other. The mBridge project deliberately uses digital currencies and involves the PBoC, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Bank of Thailand, and also the UAE's central bank. So these are all means for China to set up an international digital platform for currency transaction based on the digital yuan as its major currency. Now, it's actually likely that there's a much simpler way than establishing these systems, although they will be needed. And that is you just integrate it further with Alipay and WeChat Pay, and you allow foreign users to access it. Interestingly, for example, WeChat Pay cannot be accessed by US residents. So this is another kind of part of the future of these digital currencies, which will certain countries perhaps sanction them with regulations on their use. So prospects for the internationalization of the yuan, which have not been very good for the simple reason that the Chinese have kept controls over international capital flows intact. Yes, they've opened up these connect schemes between Hong Kong and the mainland, stocks, bonds, but international capital flows across the Chinese border remain closely controlled. And the Chinese government aims to keep relatively low volatility in the exchange rate, although the yuan has become quite flexible. Overall, this is quite unlike the neoliberal model of having free movement of capital, totally flexible exchange rates with sometimes great volatility, and measures of monetary autonomy, especially for larger economies. So as the Chinese are internationalizing their currency, the yuan, they're trying to chart a middle course between the neoliberal international monetary system and China's own developmental needs. China is fudging the trade-offs between these three major areas of the monetary trilemma that I just mentioned. They are trying to keep control over capital flows and a relatively stable and managed exchange rate while assuring a high degree of domestic monetary autonomy. But this arrangement has hindered the internationalization of the yuan because it faces, as I just mentioned, continued restrictions on its movement across Chinese borders, and therefore it's not as easy a tool to invest in as especially the US dollar. International financial actors just do not have the same level of access, of ease of access, as well as of liquidity and depth of financial markets as they have with the US. I just mentioned the pipelines. This has been the way the Chinese have managed the currency. But the e-CNY's features here really could come in handy because you can manage capital flows, especially across a border, because they will be on designated platforms or at least on designated apps that are on a platform. One could easily manage these pipelines or manage capital flows much more easily with a digital currency. It would actually allow the Chinese to open up these channels, indeed, probably widen these channels to a degree where most users wouldn't even notice capital controls. So the e-CNY clearly has applications in terms of broadening capital flows across Chinese borders while keeping overall state control intact. Pipelines could be radically open and altered, enhanced transparency and traceability could enable the PBoC to rapidly flag suspicious behavior and large speculative capital movements. This could engender a much more open, yet still controlled management of capital flows, and that's in many ways what the Chinese aim for. So mainstream analysis of yuan internationalization, which continue to insist that China must adapt to the tenets of the neoliberal international monetary system, by fully liberalizing its currencies, exchange rate, and even more importantly, fully liberalizing capital flows across Chinese borders, this might actually not so much be the case. The e-CNY, due to its digital traceability, could allow Chinese government, especially the PBoC and Chinese Foreign Exchange Administrator, to step more into the background while actually keeping overall control. And as I mentioned, Chinese strategy has tried to exploit gray areas in this management and use targeted and measured capital account opening. And this could, as I mentioned, really be expanded to an extent that there are many, many more capital movements across Chinese borders than there are now. So ultimately, the e-CNY is part of ongoing efforts by the Chinese government to construct an efficient and stable financial system while preserving the political supremacy of the CCP. As many of my colleagues in political science have formed to point out, the Chinese Communist Party is all about control. We see this even more so nowadays, unfortunately. And a digital currency could allow them to keep control over important, large capital flows while liberalizing smaller ones. So the nature of a central bank digital currency could be really well suited to Chinese objectives, these dual objectives of basically providing greater convenience, but also much greater insight into financial flows and risks. It is indeed truly a brave new world of money. But even if the e-CNY boosts the yuan's international status, a multipolar monetary order is unlikely to emerge overnight. We're coming back to the incredible dominance, awesome dominance, one might say, of the US dollar. And somewhat counterintuitively, incumbents like the United States can discourage new challengers by actually expanding the amount of safe debt. This is one of the few cases where more debt might actually be good, because you crowd out, the US has the biggest, safest, most liquid, deepest financial markets, and they're likely in relative terms to remain so. And if the US just issues more and more debt, it'll crowd out any challenger and their debt instruments. But conversely, if the Chinese, this fintech innovation of the e-CNY is successful and does carve out an international ecosystem that provides much greater convenience, lower costs, and faster processing times, and at the same time, Washington misses the boat on this major innovation and does not develop a CBDC, then within a decade or so, this could truly undermine the US dollar's global status. And I will end it here. Thank you so much. And we can move over to Q&A.
Thank you, Chris, for the very informative and interesting presentation on a timely topic. The audience has lots of questions for you, so let's now move on to the Q&A session. And the first question is, let me just scroll up. It's a question/comment, and it is, since money functions as a generalized IOU, it is a psychological construct. Should a fixed physical asset serve as an anchor to a concrete operation in view of money than as an IOU? The focus should be on who controls the money supply. Do you have what are your thoughts and comments on that?
Okay, well, I think this question is targeted at two issues. First, should there be some physical backup to money, such as gold, for example, or silver? And that question is no, because then basically one constrains the supply of money to the supply of gold. Just to go back in history, during the gold standard in the late 1880s, 1890s, there was a lack of gold, and the global economy went into a depression. There wasn't enough money supply. So that's not such a good thing. But the question of who actually should be providing a monetary instrument, especially in view of cryptocurrencies, is a really interesting one. I mean, could people trust a decentralized group of folks, like for Ethereum or Bitcoin, that establish protocols and that kind of govern the currency? Should they be prioritized, or should they have a currency that is better managed than a state? That is an interesting question. In history, generally, states have won out. So yes, states have tied their currency to gold, historically often, because that provided assurance that there will be no debasement of the currency. But in modern times, states have issued fiat currencies for the reasons I just explained. And it's basically been a competition amongst different states, their competitiveness, their trustworthiness in terms of which monetary instrument is globally used. And this is still the reason why the US dollar reigns supreme, is that global trust in the monetary authorities of the United States, despite a lot of problems, are quite high. And a digital currency, if it's a CBDC, doesn't really change much. It's a technological innovation, but the political nature, the fundamental nature of who issues the currency and the trust inscribed into that currency remains the same.
Got it. Thank you. Next question. Could you address the status of the oil future exchange in Shanghai?
Okay, yeah. So the Shanghai, about 3 years ago, and I've written on that, has established an oil futures exchange. It has been trading quite a few futures. I haven't looked recently how important it is. It has kind of carved out a spot as number 3 globally. So that is behind New York and London, where the WTI contract and the Brent contract are being traded. And it's become important as a benchmark for Asian oil trade. But things have been quite chaotic in the oil trade recently. And the Chinese have become less important because of the COVID lockdowns. And indeed, the Chinese are actually now probably going to become a big oil exporter because they're going to be exporting surplus reserves. There just was a story today by Bloomberg on this. Now, for the Shanghai Exchange to truly become an international or even Asian-wide benchmark, it would require the internationalization of the yuan. It would require a connection between the digital yuan, the traders, international traders active on the Shanghai Exchange, and links to the outside world. And so far, we haven't seen definitive movements in this direction.
Got it. I see there's a question pertaining to CIPS, but I think you've addressed that in midway of your presentation already. So I'm going to skip that question. The next question is, with the newfound interest in the BRICS, that's the 5 major economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Do you believe there will be a greater push for the yuan in the economic bloc?
Yeah. So I just went over, I looked at the Q&A because there was a question over there that talks about, yes, this is a financial technological innovation, but underlying the yuan are still the fundamental problems of the Chinese economy and how trustworthy are Chinese authorities, being that it is an authoritarian form of government with a lack of rule of law. And that is an absolutely valid concern. So the Chinese have tried to work around it with basically using countries such as the BRICS and other major, mainly developing country trade partners to just try and establish an ecosystem where people trade in the yuan. And in that kind of a situation, one doesn't necessarily need such high trust in Chinese monetary authorities and political authorities, ultimately. But I would like to note that although China, from a political point of view, looks quite shaky, that Chinese monetary authorities, the People's Bank of China, have been highly conservative, comparatively speaking. Indeed, the PBoC has been referred to as the Bundesbank of Asia. And interest rates have traditionally been kept quite high, although that is not changing because the US is raising interest rates very rapidly. So as I said, we are really in this great age of uncertainty. And the Chinese goal, though, I think is quite limited. They do not want to replace the dollar. They want to establish an ecosystem where they can trade with friendly countries in their own currency without any oversight or influence or potential sanctions levied against them by the United States. And yes, the BRICS countries are indeed very important in this endeavor. And the clear case that we're seeing right now is Chinese trade with Russia, which slumped in February, March, and has since taken off very rapidly. Trade has grown a lot because the Russians have to basically import a lot of stuff from China nowadays because they cannot get it from anywhere else. And trading between the ruble and the yuan has taken off with this. Trade increasingly between Russia and China is between these two currencies. Now, one might argue this is an exceptional case, and I would agree. This is truly exceptional because of the sanctions levied against Russia. But it's an interesting use case of how the Chinese are likely to proceed into the future.
Got it. Thank you. Next question is, given the energy requirements of digital money, what will it take to make it more usable?
Okay, the problem with the energy requirements of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is still using an old system, is that its supply is based on miners who run large rigs of basically computing, computing power basically, and mine it, through these cryptographic technologies. And Ethereum has moved away from this. Ethereum is being now not mined anymore. Its supply will be decided by a group that validates transactions and the need for more Ethereum in the system. So even cryptocurrencies are moving away from this because it's extremely wasteful. I mean, the greatest, I would say, environmental disaster of the last few years is Bitcoin. It's just because it's such a waste. I mean, there's really no reason. The price of Bitcoin is in many ways defined at the lower range price by how much energy, how much it costs to mine it. And that's sad given the situation we're in with the environment. And some Bitcoin miners say they use green energy, but trust and verify. The Chinese central bank digital currency works on a different measure. It uses energy as well, but it uses as much energy as Alipay and WeChat Pay, and as such, it's not at the level that DLT or blockchain technology would require at all.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Would you have any insights into the future of payment apps and digital currency in the US?
Oh, okay. Well, I haven't studied the US as carefully as China and actually even the Europeans, because the Europeans are much further along. In the United States, the Federal Reserve has launched quite a lot of research into furnishing a digital dollar. I would suspect with the technological capabilities of the United States, it would not be very difficult. From a technological point, the problem is legal, the problem is political. Such a move would have to be authorized by the US Congress, and there is substantial opposition in Congress to such a move. Some of it stems from a more libertarian mind frame, but a lot of it is lobbying by the banks and the dominant American payment processors, Visa, MasterCard, against such a move because they fear being replaced. That fear is valid, justified, but it can be assuaged by, for example, the design the Chinese have been adopting or the design that Japan and Europe are looking into. They're facing the same problems. They do not want to collapse the banking system, and then there's only one bank, which would be, in the case of the US, the Federal Reserve. And we could conceivably have a system like that with the CBDC. One monopolistic huge bank, everybody puts their money there and takes it out and in, and then you would have investment banks and specialized service providers. But that would obviously be catastrophic for the financial system, especially the incumbents. So they are lobbying against it in the US. And as such, it's really very much a political question. I would argue that once CBDCs become common globally and truly a threat to American monetary dominance, we will see America move fast, very fast. But that's still a ways away.
Got it. Thank you. Next question involves Hong Kong and Macau. And the question is, can this digital economy be used to prevent Chinese, Hong Kong, and Macau residents access to US dollars?
That's not the intention at all. Well, again, who knows with all the things that are happening in China, but Hong Kong is clearly being kept as a window onto the world, especially in the financial realm. The Hong Kong dollar remains pegged to the US dollar. So this would first necessitate Hong Kong, going off the peg, which would be a fraught and difficult process. So no, the whole idea of integrating the digital yuan with what is the digital fast payment system, it's called FPS in Hong Kong, is to basically make trade between the two, the city-state of Hong Kong and mainland China, much more convenient, much easier, much frictionless, to internationalize the yuan thereby, and to continue to use Hong Kong as an international financial center that helps China's development. So I do not see this in the cards.
Okay, thank you. Next question, I think you've addressed this as well, but could e-CNY avoid the financial sanctions from the West?
Yes, I mean, this is the PBoC over a year ago stated, 1.5 years ago, at a time when they still were a lot more frank and open about what they're doing. They stated quite clearly that the e-CNY is about Chinese monetary sovereignty. So that this is a means of assuring the continued use of the yuan domestically, so that it doesn't get replaced by cryptocurrencies or other currencies, and also the international importance of the yuan to build up an ecosystem, especially for trade, but also for some use of foreign reserves. So a country like Turkey, or certainly now Russia. Russia has about 10% of its reserves in the yuan. So a digitalization of a link between the PBoC and the Central Bank of Russia would make it much, much easier for the Russians to use the yuan, for international payments, international reserve, asset allocations, etc. And that's really the goal. Now, I don't think the Chinese are fooling themselves that they could replace the dollar. Indeed, they've made it very clear that's not their purpose. But they would like to build up an ecosystem that might account for 10, 15% of international payments. The yuan now accounts for only 2.2%. So that is maybe getting close to 10%, where a large chunk of Chinese trade is invoiced in yuan. And the Chinese have done research with, interestingly, Eastern European exporters to China. And the research showed that these exporters could probably save about 10% in costs by using a digital platform, directly invoicing in yuan, and then converting it to their own currencies, the zloty or the forint or whatever. And so there's a big cost saving and a big convenience factor involved in this as well.
Okay, the next question pertains to the role of commercial banks. How will the CBCD affect the role of commercial banks?
This is an interesting question. I've kind of addressed it just a bit. In America, the banks and the payment providers, especially Visa, MasterCard, are extremely concerned about a digital currency because, as I mentioned, it could enable a central bank basically to replace a lot of their functions. In China, the People's Bank of China has made very clear that its goal is to keep the present system intact. And the way it works is that the e-CNY is M0, it's cash. That cash gets provided by the PBoC just as it would with more traditional electronic forms. So, you have liquidity injections into the economy, or money is being taken out. There are, bond purchases and bond sales by the central bank. But this currency, the e-CNY, is provided to the large banks, and these are mostly state banks, but there's two very large banks, WeBank, which is owned by Tencent, so the owner of WeChat, and MyBank, which is owned by Alipay, which is called Ant Financial, and that is in turn owned in part by Alibaba. So all of these banks will then basically be the service providers. They will be the custodians. They will issue apps where one can use the e-CNY on, in addition to the apps such as Alipay and WeChat Pay. They will have banking services where one can take the e-CNY and put it into a CD or a savings account. And Alipay and WeChat Pay will continue to provide the bulk of payment services within China. Actually, anybody who's been to China knows it's all QR code based, extremely convenient if one has it, which we as foreigners generally don't. So we are kind of stuck in line with old-fashioned cash and really, really look antiquated compared to everyone else. But this system, by design, will be kept intact under what the Chinese government is trying to achieve with the e-CNY. Since most of the banks are state-owned, there is also not that kind of lobbying of distrust and opposition. Everybody's kind of going along with the scheme. But the Chinese also have been very slow. I would have actually expected the e-CNY to be rolled out nationwide by about now. And they're just doing it now in 3 provinces, province-wide. And so they're taking their time. They're being very cautious. I suspect it has just a lot to work out kinks in the system and get indeed the computing power up to scale, which is quite massive to make the system work well.
Got it. Thank you. Next one is a comment. Helen recently said the US will look at creating a digital currency to speed up and make more efficient transactions. But the US and UK are far behind other countries to move to digital currency. What are your thoughts on that comment?
So I'll be very brief. The Federal Reserve is putting in place, it's being rolled out right now, a new interbank transaction system, which should make it much easier. Most of us in the US, we move money from one bank account to another. It takes about 3 days. So if I do it today, I put it in, I generally get the money by Friday. And if there's a weekend, it's longer. The new system should be much, much faster. And the Federal Reserve argues that for now, there's no need for a digital dollar because with this new system, many of the concerns about the old system, it's difficult, it's clunky, it's slow, will be addressed. Now, as I mentioned, a digital currency has great other advantages, but also real concerns, the biggest being privacy concerns. I mean, honestly, this would mean that the Federal Reserve could see any transaction that we do, anything, and as long as it's not in cash, you would be basically also liable for taxes and stuff like that. Indeed, one could imagine a system that is purely based on a digital currency in which no one has to file their taxes. There's no paperwork involved. It is all automatic. The system is set up in a way that currency transactions are flagged if they're taxable, and automatically the IRS knows when a taxable payment has been received. Taxes get automatically deducted. And at the end of the year, there might just be some accounting, just some to do. Truly a brave new world of money. It also could make a taxation system, by the way, a lot fairer. So rich people really would have to pay their taxes. And everyone could see exactly what's going on, given sufficient computing power and analytical tools. But yeah, this is still maybe a ways off.
Got it. Thank you. Next question. Could the e-CNY transfer abroad easily during the war?
Could you repeat this?
Yes. Could the e-CNY transfer abroad easily during the war?
During the war? Okay, I'm not quite sure what this question is focusing on, Famwin. I'm not sure what war we're talking about here. Is it the Russia-Ukraine, or are we talking about a potential invasion of Taiwan? But theoretically speaking, the PBoC, if it were a purely digital system, citizens still could be under capital controls in China as they are now. So, for example, now every Chinese citizen is allowed to take $50,000 worth of currency out of the country. With the e-CNY, that same rule could be in place. And if, let's say, there were a war, and let's talk about the Taiwan scenario, or maybe a China-Indo war, if something like that would be to occur, it is very likely that, yes, there would be massive capital flight out of China. Many Chinese citizens would lose trust and faith in the Chinese economy and thereby the Chinese currency. And something like that is happening right now. with COVID zero. And as a result, the Chinese government could basically lower the threshold, lower the amount of money people are allowed to take off, or make it more difficult, or strangulate the pipelines by which money goes out with companies. So yes, this e-CNY wouldn't provide a means to kind of move money illicitly out of the country, I suspect, unless somebody finds a way to do it, but no.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, and we have at least 10 more questions to go, so I will have to pick and choose.
Okay,
so
yeah, I see a lot of questions.
Yeah, next question is, China has been building up its gold reserves. Is this a strategy validating the digital currency?
I think a lot of countries have been building up their gold reserves. Now, one thing a lot of people forget about is that China is the largest gold producer on earth. Largest producer of gold. So folks in the United States who are fond of gold and even advocate moving back to the gold standard, the geopolitical implications of that are quite dire, because then you basically put your economic fortunes in the hands of the Chinese and the Russians. Russia is a very large gold producer, and the South Africans. So not the best arrangement. The reason the Chinese are doing it is basically reserve diversification. And even more so nowadays, because the sanctions against Russia, the interesting part is not so much the use of the US dollar, it's the use of the US dollar, the euro, the yen, the Aussie dollar, the Kiwi dollar, the loonie, Swedish krona, everything. Everybody's on board with these sanctions. There is really nowhere to go, except maybe the Indian rupee and the Chinese yuan. So in such a situation, again, reserve diversification becomes very difficult. Western sanctions are quite universal. For a country such as China, as well as Russia, diversifying into currencies that are unlikely to be sanctioned, such as the ruble, for example, of China, and especially gold, is quite convenient. So it's really a diversification of risk. It's not meant to peg the Chinese currency to gold. Chinese wouldn't do that. They understand the dynamics. And it's also not to have some gold-backed financial assets that could relate directly to the e-CNY. I mean, these might come along, but...
Okay, I am going to scroll down to this question. With the rise of the buy now and pay later service like Klama, is there a service that can emerge from the digital yuan?
Well, these services already exist in China with Alipay and WeChat Pay. Indeed, it's one of the reasons the Chinese government has started to clamp down on them. There are various reasons, some good and some bad. This is one of the better reasons for the tech clampdown that started last year, and that is that these payment apps were rapidly moving into the financial sector. Alipay and Ant Financial established Yuebao, which is the largest money market fund on earth, and basically were sucking capital out of the banking system on the one hand, and then providing extremely convenient credit services to Chinese consumers. And the People's Bank of China got quite concerned that this would create a credit, like a sort of credit, a consumer credit boom that would end badly. And indeed, we've seen this in South Korea, where there was a consumer credit boom in the aftermath of the global financial, it was actually in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis, if I'm correct, in the early 2000s. No, maybe I'm wrong on this one, but South Korea liberalized its financial system after the Asian financial crisis, and one of the outcomes was a massive consumer credit boom. People all used their credit cards and swiped and swiped and swiped, and in the end, people just couldn't manage it, and many of them went bankrupt, and it caused quite a lot of consternation. And this is basically what the Chinese government got scared of. So the digital yuan would not make a profound difference because the very advanced electronic payments infrastructure is already in place in China, and a lot of these services are already there. Indeed, right now, the problem is the government has put this enormous regulatory, cap on these companies, and that has, decreased both financial risk, but also financial innovation.
Okay, it's already almost 3 p.m., so we have to end here. Thank you very much, Dr. McNally, for sharing your research with the audience today. And thank you to all our audience for participating this afternoon. And I would like to invite everyone to attend our next EWC Insights on October 19th for a talk by Dr. Kim Fassler. Until then, have an awesome rest